We are on DAF Yudam and Aleph, but let me just review what we were doing yesterday. This whole conversation started because Levi asked his Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, he said, why is there not a 16th person in the Mishnah who is exempt from Yibum and who paters or tzara? And Rebbe's response was, I think these guys got no brain in his skull, which was a startling answer. Basically, Rebbe saying that, no, you're mistaken. And the question is, why is Levi mistaken? So the Gemara's initial answer is because our Mishnah would not discuss issues where there's a machlokas tanoim. And the only case that Levi was referring to when he was talking about the 16th woman in the Mishnah, he was talking about Anusas Aviv falling to Yibum. His father's Imo Anusas Aviv. It's possible for my mother, if I was born out of wedlock, and my brother, my paternal brother, would be allowed to marry my father's girlfriend, who was my mother. He marries her, then he dies, and she falls to me for Yibum. Why isn't that in the Mishnah? And Rebbe's response is, that's a silly question, because that's a machlokas tanoim. Only the Chachamim say that it is permitted to marry Anusas Aviv, that your father's girlfriend. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not permitted to marry your father's girlfriend, and therefore such a situation would never occur. Because just like I can't marry my father's girlfriend because she's my mother, my brother can't marry my father's girlfriend because she's Anusas Aviv, a person with whom my father had an encounter. So, therefore, since it's a machlokas tanoim, whether such a case could ever be, the Mishnah doesn't list it. So then the Gemara asked the question, how can you tell me that our Mishnah doesn't list cases of machlokas? What about the criteria that Rabbi Chia had set down in our Mishnah? He said that each one of these cases of the 15 women has to fulfill the following situation. In the case when you have 4 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, and Reuven and Shimon are married to 2 sisters, normally we say if Reuven and Shimon both die, then Levi and Yehuda, neither of them can do Yibum to either sister because of the principle of Achos Zekukaso. That if 2 women fall to Yibum, even if they're from separate homes, since they're sisters, each one has a zika, and the sister of the woman that has zika, right, they cancel each other out. I have to do chalitza, and I don't do yibum. Now, but that's only true if the 2 sisters are not an additional erva. But let's say Machla is an erva to Levi, and Noah is an erva to Yehuda. So therefore, Levi. So there's only zika to Levi from Noah. There's only zika to Yehuda from Machla, and therefore, since there's only one zika, there's no achazukukaso there. Ha'asura lazeh muteres lazeh, v'asura lazeh muteres lazeh. Levi can't marry the woman who's an ervatim, but he can marry her sister, do yibum with the sister, and Yehuda is vice versa, the exact opposite case. The only way that you can satisfy that, according to the way we've been describing this scenario, according to Rabbi Chia, in the case of Eishes Ach Shelohaya Ba'olamo, is to go according to a situation of machlokas. So how can you tell me that the Mishnah doesn't talk about cases of machlokas? And so the Gemara had answered that Rabbi, who holds that our Mishnah is not dealing with cases of machlokas, doesn't hold of that rule of Rabbi Chia that each one of the 15 women has to conform to this principle of shtei achayos, 2 sisters that fall to, that in the case of 4 brothers, hasur lazeh muteres lazeh, hasur lazeh muteres lazeh. That's where we left off yesterday. So that's our quick review, and now we come into Rav Ada Karchina, Leslie, Klali Leslie, Rav Ada rather Karchina Kameda Rav Kahana Omar Mishmei de Rava, and he says in the name of Rava La'olam Islay La Rebbe Hani Klali. No, Rebbe does hold of these rules, of the rules of Rebbe Chia. And however, what about the fact that the case of Eishes Ach Shelohaya Ba'olamo is a case of machlokes? V'hachika Omar Lei, Imo Anusas Aviv Bechado Mishkachas La Betarte Loka Mishkachas La. And the issue really wasn't so much the issue of machlokes for Rebbe. The issue for Rebbe is that I hold of the principles of Rebbe Chia, that with each one of the women of this Mishnah, you have to have a situation where 2 sisters can fall before 2 brothers for Yibum, can fall before Levi and Yehuda, and you can have a scenario whereby Levi is mutter to one of the sisters and usher to the other, and the same thing with Yehuda, and therefore Hasur lazeh muteres lazeh, Hasur lazeh muteres lazeh. He says that cannot be accomplished in the case of Imo Anusas Aviv. What do I mean? I mean as follows. What would be the scenario in a case where if these two sisters fall to me for Yibum, then one of these women is my mother, and therefore I can't do Yibum with her, but therefore I could do Yibum with her sister? That's impossible, even with the situation of where I'm born out of wedlock. Why? Because if these two women are sisters, what's the scenario? Yaakov is the father of these four guys, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Yaakov has two sons, Reuven and Shimon. And then he has a fling extramaritally, and Levi is born. And then he has another child, and that child is Yehuda. And he has another fling with another woman, and that's going to be Yehuda. So comes along Reuven and Shimon, and they go ahead and marry these two girls. They go and marry these two. I'm sorry. Once again, Yaakov has 4 sons, and Yaakov also has a situation, right, where Reuven and Shimon go ahead and marry the girlfriend of their father. So va'achosek shivim sheyehu beis achas noflos liabim. He says, "I Yaakov shtei achayos onas," because the case would be as follows: if Yaakov had a fling with two sisters, that's the case that we're dealing with. Yaakov has a fling with two sisters. From one sister Levi is born, and from the other sister Yehuda is born. That's the scenario. Now, if that's the situation, and then Reuven and Shimon go ahead and marry these two sisters, which the father had already had a relationship with, and then Reuven and Shimon die. So it turns out that one of these women is Levi's mother, and one of these women is Yehuda's mother. Perfect, right? There's only one problem. You can't say ha'asur lazeh muteres lazeh in that case. Because if my mother is usur to me, then my mother's sister is also usur to me. Because an aunt, according to the Torah, is an erva. So you can't fulfill the criterion of asur lazeh muteres lazeh, asur lazeh muteres lazeh. The only way that you could fulfill it is if Yaakov, the father, married two non-sisters. If he married two non-sisters and two women who are not sisters, one woman gave birth to Levi and the other one gave birth to Yehuda, and then Reuven and Shimon married these two women, and then Reuven and Shimon died, and then so one of them that falls to Yibum is Levi's mother, one of them that falls to Yibum is Yehuda's mother. Then it is possible for Levi to do Yibum with one and Yehuda to do Yibum with the other. But in that case, they're not sisters. So therefore, the way that the Gemara speaks it out is like this. He says, because Rabbi Chia has two criteria. One criterion is that you have to say Hasur lazeh muteres lazeh, and the other criterion is that they have to be two sisters, and that has to work with each one of the women of our Mishnah. I Yaakov beis achayos anas, if Yaakov had a relationship with two sisters, so achosa shehi yevimta mishkachasla, so then you could have a scenario where two sisters fall to Yibum, they're two sisters, and they're both mothers of Levi and Yehuda respectively. But Hasur lazeh muteres lazeh lo mishkachasla. But you're not going to be able to say that Levi could marry one and Yehuda could marry the other. They're both going to be usher either because of a mother or because of an aunt. V'i beis nachrios anas, and if Yaakov married two women who were not sisters, so then Hasur lazeh muteres lazeh mishkachasla, then it is possible for Levi to marry one and Yehuda to marry the other. But achosu shehi yevimta lo mishkachasla. But you're not going to fulfill the other criterion, which is that they have to be sisters. Okay, that's the reason why Rebbe was taking issue with Levi. Not because I don't hold of that issue. The Mishnah won't talk about cases of machlokes, but rather because the case of Imo Anusas Aviv is not something that you can fit Rabbi Chia's rules to. Rav Ashi Amar la'olam lesle l'Rebbe hani klali. So Rav Ashi gives a totally different answer, and he says the reason why Rebbe was critical of Levi is because, not because he holds of Reb Chia's rule about you have to say of each one of the women hasur lazem uteres lazeh, etc. Uveplugta kamairi, and it's also not true that Rebbe doesn't hold that there could be cases of machlokes in the Mishnah. So why then did he say that Levi appears like he doesn't have a brain in his skull? Why didn't you discern from the verbiage of our Mishnah the masnisin Rebbe Yehudahi, the aser banusas aviv? And I can prove to you that our Mishnah holds like Rebbe, is authored by Rebbe Yehuda. And Rebbe Yehuda says that imo anusas aviv, that you can never have such a case, because you can never have Reuven's brother Shimon marrying Reuven's mother, even if Reuven was born out of wedlock, because according to Rebbe Yehuda, Shimon is never allowed to marry anusas aviv. He can never marry a woman that was intimate with his father. And now how do we know that our Mishnah goes like Rebbe Yehuda and not like the Chachamim? The Ketani, because you have to go to the next Mishnah, which we're going to see in just a few days on DAF Yud Gimel. It says, Sheish arayos chamuros me'elu mipnei shehinusuas la'acherim tzarosein mutaros. The next Mishnah, which we've talked about before, lists 6 additional women, in addition to the 15 in our Mishnah. Now, these 6 women are also ervas. They're actually even a higher level of erva than the 15 in our Mishnah. Why then are they not listed in our Mishnah? Because you could never have a case of where my brother could marry one of those women who's an erva to me. And therefore, there's never going to be a situation where my brother is married to one of them and he has a tzara, such that the tzara will also be usher. The only time that this erva could be married to someone is if it's not my brother. And thus, if that someone else who's not my brother dies, I'm allowed to marry the tzara, because it's shalom b'makom mitzvahs. There's no mitzvah of yibum involved. And that's why the Mishnah doesn't list it, because our Mishnah is talking only about cases where the erva paters the tzara from yibum. Here, these 6 women, there's no yibum possible. And what's the first on the list? Imo, your mother. Ve'eshes aviv, your father's wife. Va'achos aviv, and your father's sister, etc. Now, my imo. Now, what's the case of imo? That's discussed in the Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel. It can't be your father's wife, because that's the case number 2, Eishes Aviv. So rather what? Elolav anusas aviv. It must be talking about your mother from an extramarital relationship. And therefore, and yet the Mishnah still says that it's impossible for this woman to ever fall to you for yibum, even though she was never married to your father. Man shamas le de islay haisvar Rebbe Yehuda da aser banusas aviv mishamachi lotani le. The only Tana who could possibly hold that it's impossible for this anusas aviv to ever fall to Reuven to Yibum is Rebbe Yehuda, and that's why our Mishnah cannot be. Our Mishnah cannot list anusas aviv, because it's in the very next Mishnah, and the very next Mishnah says that anusas aviv can't fall for Yibum, and therefore Rebbe was critical of Levi. He said, Levi, why would you ever think that imo anusas aviv would be one of the cases of erva that paters et tzara, if we already see that our Mishnah based on Daf Yud Gimel holds like Rebbe Yehuda? Okay, Amalei Ravina LeRavashi LeRebbe Yehuda Nami Mishkachas La. So Ravina objects. Ravina says, wait a minute, you could have a case of imo anusas aviv falling to Yibum according to Rebbe Yehuda as well. Di'i avar v'nasiv. What would happen if, according to Rebbe Yehuda, Shimon, who is not the son of this woman, but rather the brother of the son of this woman, goes ahead and marries his father's anusas aviv? What if he goes ahead and does it? Now, according to Rebbe Yehuda, it's not really a marriage; it's a sham. There's no halachic marriage here. But what if he does so and he dies? So there, maybe you could argue that even Rebbe Yehuda would agree, in theory, perhaps. Like, right? And v'naflu liyibum fnei b'nav listening, right? Maybe that would be a case where Rebbe Yehuda would agree that if he went ahead and married her, then she would be usher for Yibum, and her tzara would also be usher for Yibum. The Gemara answers Di'i lo katani. Because in a theory of what if a brother goes ahead and does it b'di'evid, we're not talking about a case where a brother does a forbidden marriage. We're talking about where the brother does a permitted marriage in our Mishnah, and therefore that's not a legitimate case to list. So Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana below Di'i nami mishkachas la. But Rav Ashi continues the objection to Rav Kahana, And even though he's defending this position, now he raises another objection. He says, but wait a minute, I could come up with a case of even where the brother does a permitted marriage, you could still have a scenario where a mother could fall to Yibum. What's the case? Yaakov Anas Kalasa. Yaakov, the father of the brothers, is the Rasha, and he goes ahead and has a relationship with his daughter-in-law. Reuven is married to a woman, Reuben's married to Rachel, and the father goes ahead and has a relationship with Rachel, V'holid mimena bein, and he has a child from his daughter-in-law, who obviously is going to be a mamzer, but it's Shimon. Umeis Reuven below banim, and then Reuven dies, and Reuven didn't do any forbidden marriage. Reuven was legitimately married to Rachel. V'nafula kamei bara, and so she falls to her own son Shimon, who's the mamzer. She falls to him for Yibum. That umigu di'ihi asira tzarasi nami asira, and so therefore we should say that that's a case of tsaras imo, a case where the Mishnah should have listed. Even according to Reb Yehuda, it's possible to have a mother fall to you for Yibum. So Amar lei ba'achvasa de hetera kamairi ba'achvasa de isura lo kamairi. That's the way the Marav Ranshberg changes the gears. It's not ba'achosa, but rather ba'achvasa, with an aleph at the end. And he says, we're only talking about legitimate brothers. We're not talking about bastard brothers. And that's why our Mishnah also doesn't discuss that case. Because to suggest that our Mishnah is talking about a bastard child of Rachel, who's now Reuven's brother, it is possible, but we're not going to those are not cases that our Mishnah is discussing. The Afal Pike. So now the Gemara says, in conclusion, even though Rebbe was critical of Levi for suggesting that Imo Anusas Aviv should be the 16th woman of our Mishnah, Levi still Badka Levi b'masnisa. Levi still persisted in his own personal version of the Mishnah. He listed a 16th woman, and he said it's possible for Imo Anusas Aviv to fall for Yibum, and she would pater her tzara. Would you mind closing the door so we can just have a... Thank you. Detani Levi, Imo pa'amim poteres tzarasu, pa'amim eno poteres tzarasu, because this is how Levi taught. He taught that it is possible sometimes when your mother falls to you for Yibum that she will exempt her tzara, and sometimes she doesn't exempt her tzara from Yibum. Ketzad, what's the case? Ha'isa Imo nesuas aviv, if a man was married to a woman, and this woman is my mother, v'nises la'achiv me'aviv, and then Shimon goes ahead and marries this woman. Now, how could Shimon go ahead and marry his father's wife? The father divorced her, he falls in love with her, and he goes ahead and marries her. But that's not a marriage. The Torah says that's not a legitimate marriage. So in that case, umeis, and then Shimon dies, zuhi imo she'ein poteres tzaras. That's a scenario where the mother doesn't even fall for Yibum. There's no Zika because she wasn't legitimately married to Shimon. And therefore the other wife that Shimon had, to whom he was legitimately married, falls for Yibum. And therefore you can't say that Reuven's mother paters the tzara from Yibum, because Reuven's mother doesn't really legitimately fall to Yibum. However, Haisa imo anusas aviv v'nisas la'achiv. However, and this is true even according to Rebbe Yehuda, Rashi says, even according to Rebbe Yehuda, that it's usher to marry your father's girlfriend, but if you do go ahead and violate the halacha and marry her, you're still halachically married to her. So if therefore Shimon went ahead and married his father's anusa, his father's girlfriend, and that happens to be Reuven's mother, and then it falls to Reuven for Yibum, that's a case where she was legally married to Shimon, and therefore she will pater her tzara. Zuhi imo shepoter sarasa. V'yafal pisha shana chacham b'mishnah seinu chamesh esrei. And yet Levi's got to deal with Rebbe's Mishnah, even though our rabbi is referring to his own Rebbe. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had listed 15. Yesh lanu lahosiv sheish esrei kagon zu. We can add an additional one, and therefore Levi sort of reconciles his own thinking with the ordering of the Mishnah. The Mishnah lists 15 women and not a 16th, and it says that the imo is a case where you can't have yibum. He says that's only talking about where it's imo, where everything was done kosher. But in a situation where the brother went ahead and illicitly married his father's anusas aviv, so then it is possible to have a case of a 16th woman where she'll pater her tzara from Yibum. So Amarle Reish Lakish LeRebbi Yochanan. LeLevi da'amar di'i nami kitani. So now, according to Levi, where the Mishnah is talking about in a case of a prohibited act, there is the possibility of imo falling to you for yibum. So if that's the case, then Levi obviously says that it's possible for our Mishnah to be discussing relationships and marriages that are done through Isser. If that's the case, listening hacholes liyavimtu v'chazer v'kidsha umeis balobanim demigu di'ihi asura tzarasa nami asira. He says, why then couldn't Levi have listed a 17th woman? You know what the case of the 17th woman is? What about a case where Reuven dies, he leaves over a widow, and Shimon goes ahead and does chalitza instead of doing yibum, which is his option, right? But then he decides, you know what, after I've done chalitza, I want to marry her. He's not allowed to. But if he does, there's tfisas kiddushin. He's legally married to her. And the reason is because, as we'll see in just a moment, there's only a mitzvahs lo saseh that prohibits him from marrying her. She doesn't go back to being an erva of eishesach. She just has a mitzvahs lo saseh. And that's based on the pasuk of kacha ye'aseh la'ish asher lo yivne es beis achiv. And the pasuk of chalitza says, so shall be a man who shall not build his brother's house. That asher lo yivne is a mitzvah lo saseh. That once, kivin shelo bana shuv lo yivne. If he refused to do yibum, he's no longer ever allowed to marry her. But that's only a mitzvah lo saseh. So the question is like this. Shimon goes ahead, gives her chalitza, and then he goes ahead and marries her. And then Shimon dies. So why don't we say like this? The other brothers, Levi, Yehuda, etc., they can't do yibum to this woman because she has the status of an eishesach to them. If that's the case, then Shimon's co-wife will also not be able to do yibum. She'll pater the tsar as well. And if Levi is prepared to talk about a case where a marriage was formed through a prohibited act, well, then why doesn't he talk about this case as well? Amar lei lefi she'ena b'tzaras tzara. So Rabbi Yochanan said, I have a simple answer. Because you can find a case of where the erva paters the tzara from yibum, but you can't find a case where the tzara paters another tzara from yibum. Remember we had said, the only time that you could find the case of tzaras tzara is if Shimon goes ahead and does yibum with the tzara, and then Shimon dies, and this tzara falls to Levi for yibum. So the way that it works is that since the tzara was pater, in other words, since the tzara was the co-wife of an erva to Levi, so therefore the tzara therefore even if she enters into a new marriage with Shimon, in other words, for example, Levi's sister is married to Reuven. Reuven has a second wife. Reuven dies, Shimon marries the co-wife, the tzara. And then Shimon goes and Shimon dies. And then Levi cannot marry neither the tzara nor the tzaras tzara. That's what we said. But in this case, you can't have a case of tzaras tzara. You can't have one case removed, one step removed. Why is it? Because once Shimon dies, all of the brothers are equally usher to this woman with the status of eishesach. So you could never have a case where Levi goes ahead and marries the tzara of Shimon to create a case of tzaras tzara if he dies. You can't have such a scenario because there's no legal marriage if all of the brothers have an equal prohibition of ervas eishesach. So that's why it's impossible to include it in the Mishnah. Not because it's not a legitimate case of erva and a tzara, but you can't have a case of tzaras tzara. So now the Gemara says, "V'leima le chayve lavin hi v'chayve lavin b'nei chalitza v'yibum ninu." So the Gemara's next question is, but I don't understand. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Reish Lakish fundamentally, as we'll see in just a moment. Reish Lakish is of the opinion that if Shimon does chalitza, once he does chalitza, then all of the brothers revert to a status of an erva of eishesach. That woman is to them is an erva of eishesach. But Rabbi Yochanan doesn't agree. Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that once Shimon does chalitza, then all of the brothers only have a mitzvahs lo saseh. This is going to be a fundamental machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And if that's the case, then there's a much more basic reason why this woman can't be listed in the Mishnah. It's because she's not an erva to the other brothers, and she is subject to chalitza, and she's even subject to yibum, and certainly therefore she doesn't pater her tzara from chalitza or yibum, such that if Shimon dies after marrying this woman illicitly, then she does fall for yibum and chalitza to the other brothers, according to Rabbi Yochanan. That's why the Mishnah doesn't list it. So the Gemara says, Lidvarav ka'amar lei. You're right, but Rabbi Yochanan was responding to Reish Lakish's shita. You, Reish Lakish, hold that the other brothers have a din, she has a din of an erva to the other brothers. And therefore, according to your shita, you're asking the question, why wasn't that listed in the Mishnah according to Levi? My response to you is according to your shita. I personally hold that if Shimon goes ahead and marries his chalutza, marries the woman that he did chalitza with, and then Shimon dies, then this woman does fall to Yibum and Chalitza to the other brothers. And therefore, that's why it's clear that it's not listed in the Mishnah. However, but according to you who hold that once Shimon does Chalitza with this woman, then all of the other brothers have a din of an erva to her, then your question is legitimate, but it's only according to your opinion. So therefore, my answer, according to your shita, is because you can't satisfy a case of tzara according to that. So now let's examine more carefully the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Itmar hacholotz liyavimto v'chazer v'kitsha. If a man Shimon goes ahead and does chalitza with Reuven's widow, and then he goes ahead and marries her. Amar Reish Lakish, hu ein chayav ala chalutza kares, v'achen chayavan ala chalutza kares. That Reish Lakish holds he has not done an act for which he's chayav kares. There's only an isser lo saseh. However, the other brothers she has a din of an erva to them, because once Shimon did chalitza, all of the other brothers now she's an eishesach to them, and she goes back to being an erva. Al hatzara bein hu bein ha'achim chayavan al hatzara kares. And as far as the tzara, the Reuven's other wife is concerned, then both Shimon and the other brothers are usher to her in Isser Kares. She has a din of an erva to them, because the Torah says that if you can only do one of the wives, so whichever wife you choose to do Yibur Machalitza with, only she has the mitzvah lo saseh, but all the other wives, all the other tzaras have a din of an eishesach. And Rabbi Yochanan Amar, I disagree on both points that you made. Number one, bein hu bein ha'achim ein chayven al chalutza kares v'al tzara kares. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, I hold that both wives of both widows of Reuven that fall to Yibum for the brothers, it doesn't matter whether Shimon does chalitza, Levi, Yehuda, doesn't matter which brother does chalitza. Regardless, every one of the surviving brothers have only a mitzvah lo saseh on the Yevama, or on the chalutza, and they only have a mitzvah lo saseh on the tzara of the chalutza as well. My time at the Reish Lakish. The question is now, what's Reish Lakish's reasoning? Amar kra asher lo yivne, kiven shelo bana shu lo yivne. So the answer is like this. Where do we get this whole din that there's a mitzvah lo saseh that remains on this woman after you do chalitza to her? From the pasuk of Asher lo yivne, he who shall not build his brother's home. And it's only therefore on the guy who's doing chalitza, this mitzvah lo saseh. But on all the other brothers, she reverts back to being a standard eishesach, which is an erva, chiyuv kares. And similarly, where does the mitzvah lo saseh apply to? It applies to the chalutza, to the woman that you did chalitza with. There's a mitzvah lo saseh, but on all of the other co-wives, there's a standard eishesach erva. So Reish Lakish says it's very logical. The only mitzvah lo saseh, which does not convey kares, is only between the chalutza and the choletz, the woman who got chalitza and the man who did chalitza. But on all the other brothers and on all the other tzaras, there's an Isser Erva Veishasach. But Rabbi Yochanan's argument is, Mi'ika midi d'meikar iboy haicholitz v'boy haicholitz v'boy lahaicholitz v'boy lahaicholitz v'ashta koya la b'kares. Rabbi Yochanan says, I fundamentally disagree. He says it's not possible that at the time of Reuven's death, any one of the brothers could have done chalitza. And they could have done chalitza or yibum and to any one of the wives. And yet now you're going to tell me that they revert back to an Isser Erva? No. If the Torah permits each and every one of the women to each and every one of the brothers, it must mean that all that can remain at most is a mitzvah lo saseh once chalitza or yibum is done between one brother and one wife and one widow, right? But you can't tell me that they're going to go all the way back to an Isser Kares if the Torah already permitted them. So Ela ihu shlichusa da'achim ka'avid, and ihi shlichusa da'tzara ka'avda. But rather, the way you look at it is, the choletz and the chalutza, the man and the woman who actually went through with the chalitza, they're doing the proxyship of both all of the wives and all of the brothers. So therefore, if Shimon ends up doing chalitza, he's acting as a proxy on behalf of Levi and Yehuda. And if Rachel receives chalitza, she's doing it on behalf of her tzara. And therefore, just like she has a mitzvah of Asher Lo Yivna, and he has a mitzvah of the mitzvah Slosa, say Asher Lo Yivna, so too do all of the brothers and all of the remaining tzaras. So Eisvei Rabbi Yochanan l'Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan says, I'm going to challenge you with the Brayso Reish Lakish to show you that the most that remains on all of the brothers and all of the tzaras is an Isser Lav. What's the Brayso? Hacholetz liyavimto. If a man does chalitza to the Yevama, the Chazer, the Kidsha, and then Shimon goes ahead after he did chalitza and he goes and marries her, umeis, and then he dies, tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. She legitimately is Shimon's wife, and therefore she needs to get chalitza from the brothers. The brothers can't marry her, but they at least have to give her chalitza. So bishlam alididi damina chayvi lavinin hu hainu tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. It makes perfectly good sense to me, says Rabbi Yochanan. The very fact that the brothers have to do chalitza is indicative of the fact that there's no Isser Kares. Because if there would be an Isser Kares, then there would be no Yibum or chalitza. Ela lididach hamay tzricha chalitza. But according to you, Reish Lakish, why should there be a necessity for chalitza whatsoever? If she's mamish and erva, if she's an Isser Kares, then she doesn't fall for Yibum or chalitza. So the Reish Lakish responds to him, I not so fast, Rabbi Yochanan. Take a look at the second part of that brayso. Amar echad min ha'achin v'kidsha ein la alav klum. That if one of the brothers goes ahead and presents her with kiddushin, if let's say one of the brothers, instead of doing chalitza, or let's say he does chalitza, and then he goes ahead and marries her afterwards, so then there's no marriage, and therefore if that brother dies, she doesn't fall for Yibum or Chalitza at all to any of the other brothers. And if there's only an Isser Lav, then why is it not a legitimate marriage? It should be a marriage. According to what you're saying, Rabbi Yochanan, should be a marriage. So Amar Rav Sheisha Seifas on Rabbi Akiva Dharma in Kiddushin Tovsim b'Chayvei Lavin. So Rav Sheisha says, you know what? We're stuck. This brayso is mufrach minei ubei. It's contradictory internally. It doesn't work out well according to either opinion, neither according to Rabbi Yochanan nor according to Reish Lakish. So the way we'll have to explain it is, this brayso supports Rabbi Yochanan, and really there's only an Isser Lav in all of the brothers. What about the Seifa that says that if one of the brothers after doing Chalitza does Kiddushin, and yet they're not legally married, why should that be? It's only an Isser Lav. That goes according to Rabbi Akiva. The Seifa is unique. It goes according to Rabbi Akiva, not like the Chachamim of the Reisha, because Rabbi Akiva holds that even when there's only an Isser Lav, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin, there's no marriage. So, frak the Gemara, v'listen l'divrei Rabbi Akiva ein la alav klum. Then why did the brayso say that we're switching opinions? Remember, this is only going according to Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says, Kasha. You got a good point. We don't have an answer to that.